Now it's just the two of us.
To save her, he had to undress her. Valerie Hampton woke up on silk sheets, in a luxurious suite inside a yacht swaying on the open sea. When a man walked in and she heard the most dangerous voice she'd ever heard, "You almost died." Then her last memory surfaced. The water was ice cold, lungs on fire, darkness. Someone pushed her on purpose, and she fell into the deep sea. But someone saved her, and now she was exposed on the yacht of the most feared man in New York, Salvatore Farnese, Italian mafia don, owner of half the city, and apparently, her savior. The problem? He looked at her like a predator who'd just found the perfect prey. And she, spoiled socialite, sheltered heiress, a woman who'd never had to fight for anything, felt something she'd never felt before, a silent hunger to be entirely his. Hi, my name is Lena, the owner of this channel, and today I came to thank Nicola and Jackie for their comments. And I also came to thank all the members of our channel, who are a fundamental support in the continuity of this project that I love so much. And now let me ask you a question. Can true love be born from a bet? Tell me here in the comments, and who knows, you might be the next one to appear at the beginning of the video. Chapter 1, Golden Lamp and Mortal Man.
Don't come closer.
I woke up with the sensation that the world was swaying, and it took me a few disoriented seconds to realize it wasn't just my imagination. The surface beneath me was moving in smooth, constant undulations, and my forehead burned as if someone had lit a bonfire inside my skull. I tried to open my eyes, but the light streaming through the enormous windows made me moan softly before I could focus on anything. I processed things slowly, because my brain seemed to be running in slow motion. Silk sheets against my skin, too soft to be from my apartment. Pajamas that definitely weren't the last thing I'd worn before everything went black. The suite around me was massive, with dark wood finishes and gold details that screamed obscene luxury. The panoramic windows showed nothing but open sea in all directions, no sign of land anywhere. This wasn't my room, wasn't a hotel, and by the constant movement under my feet, definitely wasn't anywhere fixed. It was a yacht, I realized with a shiver running down my spine, and a massive yacht judging by the size of this suite. I tried to stand, but my legs trembled as if they'd completely forgotten how to function, and I had to grab the edge of the king-size bed to keep from collapsing onto the gleaming floor. The dizziness came in waves, making the suite spin slightly around me as I fought to maintain my balance and process where the hell I was. "Okay, Valerie, think," I ordered myself, taking a deep breath and trying to organize the thoughts that seemed scrambled inside my head. I looked around, searching for clothes, an exit, any clue that would explain how I'd ended up here. I needed clothes that were mine, needed to understand what was happening, needed to get out of here before. That's when my eyes landed on the golden lamp on the side table, a ridiculously elegant object with crystal details that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. I didn't think twice. I stumbled over there and grabbed the thing, testing its weight in my hands as my heart started to race. It worked perfectly as a weapon, I decided, positioning the lamp like a baseball bat and trying to ignore how my hands trembled slightly. If someone came in, if whoever brought me here showed up, at least I wouldn't be completely defenseless. The thought was ridiculous considering my state, but it made me feel minimally in control of the situation. The door opened. The man who walked in knocked all the air from my lungs at once, and I couldn't explain exactly why. He was the living definition of elegant danger dressed in an Italian suit, tall enough to dominate the space just with his presence, with black hair slightly tousled as if he'd run his hand through it several times during a long night. His eyes were so dark they looked black at first glance, and they assessed me completely in less than 2 seconds. He stopped mid-movement when he saw me, his gaze dropping slowly to the lamp in my raised hands, and then returning to my face with an expression I couldn't decipher. The silence stretched for 3 eternal seconds while we stood there, me holding luxury decor as a weapon, and him watching me as if trying to decide whether I was a threat or entertainment. "Don't come closer," I said, and internally celebrated when my voice came out steady despite everything, despite my trembling legs and throbbing head. He tilted his head slightly to the side, and something touched the corner of his mouth. Not exactly a smile, but close enough to irritate me. "You're going to attack me with decor?" "With adrenaline," I corrected automatically, raising the lamp another inch just to prove my point, even knowing it was pathetic. This time the expression that crossed his face was definitely amusement. controlled but present, as if he were holding back a laugh. If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have saved your life. The words took a second to make sense in my still confused brain, and when they finally processed, I felt my stomach turn. What? He moved, and I instinctively stepped back, even knowing I had nowhere to go. But he only walked to the table on the other side of the suite with measured, calm steps. He picked up a bottle of water, placed it on the edge of the bed at a safe distance from me, and moved away again, maintaining space between us in a deliberate way that I registered even in my altered state. You were in the ocean, unconscious, with hypothermia setting in, he said, and his voice was low, controlled, carrying a natural authority that made people listen. I pulled you out. My private physician treated you, and you ran a fever all night. He paused, and his eyes assessed me again in a way that made me feel simultaneously exposed and protected. Now you're awake, which is progress. I processed this slowly, lowering the lamp slightly, but not releasing it yet, because letting go of my only defense seemed stupid, even if he'd just claimed he saved me. Why did you save me? Because you were dying. The simplicity of the answer caught me off guard, and I felt frustration rising. That doesn't answer. Sometimes it's the only answer that exists. He interrupted me with that irritating calm, and then gestured lightly toward the bed. Sit before you fall. You're pale. I wanted to refuse out of pure pride, because taking orders from a stranger who'd brought me to a yacht in the middle of the ocean seemed like a terrible idea, but my legs were shaking so badly that I had no real choice. I sat on the edge of the bed, keeping the lamp in my lap like it was a protective amulet, and it was only then that I really looked down and fully processed the silk pajamas I was wearing. They were beautiful, expensive, and definitely not mine. Someone had changed me while I was unconscious, and the realization made me swallow hard. Why am I wearing these pajamas that someone who is clearly not me put on me? I asked, and my voice came out higher than I intended, bordering on hysterical. I had to do that job, he responded with an absolute neutrality that was somehow worse than any embarrassment. Your clothes were dirty, and we needed to take care of you, but I promise I didn't touch anything, and I tried not to look either. Tried? The word came out too loud, echoing through the luxurious suite. How was I going to change you if I didn't look? He arched a dark eyebrow, and there was something in the way he spoke that suggested he was used to being obeyed without question. Besides, my job is kind of like being a surgeon, so it was purely professional. Relax, I didn't do anything. I was bothered by his casual explanation, by the way he talked about undressing an unconscious stranger, as if it were just another regular Tuesday in his life. The comparison to a surgeon should have reassured me, but somehow, it only made me more uncomfortable with the whole situation. Who are you? Salvatore Farnese. The surname hit me like a punch straight to the stomach, stealing all the air from my lungs at once. Farnese. I knew that name. Everyone in New York who circulated at the same events I did knew that name. The family that appeared in the business sections of newspapers, and also, according to rumors whispered at charity galas when people thought no one was listening, in federal investigations that never led anywhere. Farnese, I repeated slowly, letting the name weigh on my tongue as I observed him with new eyes, trying to fit the pieces together. As in several things, depending on who's asking, he responded with a dangerous half-smile, and then moved to sit in a distant chair, maintaining that calculated space between us. He didn't seem threatening in his posture, but there was something in his presence that made it clear he was completely in control of every aspect of the situation. And you're Valerie Hampton, of the Hampton family, textiles. Old money. He paused deliberately. You were at Marchetti's charity gala. I confirmed automatically. And then the memory returned with the force of a runaway train, making me choke on air, the ice-cold water burning my lungs, the darkness pulling me down, and the hands. I remembered the hands on my back a second before I fell, and then someone pushed me. Yes, he looked at me directly without looking away or softening, and there was something final in that look. I saw. It wasn't an accident. The world stopped spinning for a second, as his words processed in my brain, and I felt as if all the air molecules had been sucked from the suite at once. My heart started beating so fast, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and my hands gripped the lamp so tightly my fingers hurt. Who? The word came out as a hoarse whisper, and I cleared my throat to try again. Who pushed me? I don't know yet, but I will find out, he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like both promise and threat at the same time. Until then, you stay here. That was the last straw that completely broke my fragile self-control. I stood up again despite my legs protesting, feeling anger and fear in equal proportions rising up my throat. Excuse me, I stay. Someone tried to kill you. He interrupted me, and his voice got even quieter, lower, and and somehow that was much more threatening than any yelling could be. At a public event, with 200 witnesses who saw absolutely nothing, that requires planning, resources, and willingness to try again. He let the words weigh in the air between us like heavy lead before continuing. "Do you have private security?" "My family has," I began, but he cut me off again. "Your family was at the event, and you were pushed." He let that observation hang between us, and I felt my stomach sink as the implications started forming in my mind. "So, for now, you stay." He stood up in a fluid movement and headed toward the door, and I felt real panic for the first time since I woke up, because suddenly all of this was becoming very real, very fast. "Clothes have been provided. Breakfast in 30 minutes, he said over his shoulder, and then paused with his hand on the doorknob, turning slightly to look at me again. His eyes dropped to the lamp I was still holding with both hands, as if my life depended on it, and that dangerous, almost smile touched his lips again. "And Miss Hampton, you can put down the decor. I promise I don't bite." He paused deliberately, and his eyes darkened in a way that made me forget how to breathe. Yet, the door closed behind him with a soft final click, and I was completely alone in the luxurious suite, in the middle of the open sea, holding a golden lamp as a useless weapon and trembling from head to toe. My legs finally gave out, and I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, dropping the lamp beside me with a muffled sound against the silk sheets. I brought my hand to my mouth, trying to process everything that had just happened, trying to fit together the pieces of a reality that had turned upside down in a matter of minutes. Salvatore Farnese had saved me, undressed me, dressed me, and was now keeping me on his yacht claiming protection. And the scariest part was that he was probably right. I was pushed, I whispered to the empty room, and my voice came out shaky, breaking at the end. Reality finally hit me with full force, breaking the last barrier of denial I'd built. Someone tried to kill me. The words echoed in the silent suite, and I repeated them mentally several times, trying to make them make sense. Someone had deliberately pushed me into the ocean during a charity gala, with hundreds of people around, and no one had seen anything. Or worse, they'd seen and hadn't cared enough to help. And now, I was trapped on a yacht with a man who probably had ties to the mafia, who had seen me fall and had decided to save me for reasons he hadn't fully explained. I lay back on the bed, pulling the silk sheet over me even though I wasn't cold, and stared at the ornate ceiling while trying to process the events of the last few hours. My head still throbbed, my body still trembled, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that I should be more afraid of the man who saved me than I was. But for some reason I couldn't fully explain. I wasn't. Scared by the situation, yes. Confused and disoriented, absolutely. But of Salvatore Farnese specifically, not in the way I should be. And that, I realized with a shiver, was perhaps the scariest thing of all. Chapter 2. Protection that tastes like possession.
How did you know?
I know things.
The clothes arrived before breakfast, and that alone should have alerted me to the level of control Salvatore Farnese exercised over every detail around him. I found everything carefully folded on a chair when I came out of the shower, still wrapped in a soft towel that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, black tailored pants that looked like they'd been custom made, a white silk blouse with perfect drape, and even comfortable flats that seemed to know exactly what my feet needed. I picked up each piece slowly, turning them in my hands and checking the discreet labels of Italian brands I recognized from Fifth Avenue storefronts. The size was perfect on everything, absolutely perfect, and that left me with a strange discomfort settling in my stomach. How did he know? We'd never spoken before that morning. I was certain of it, because a man like Salvatore Farnese wasn't exactly forgettable. I got dressed mechanically, trying not to think too much about how these clothes had appeared so quickly, or how each piece fit my body like a second skin. The bathroom mirror showed me a version of myself that looked strangely composed, considering that less than 24 hours ago, someone had tried to drown me in the ocean. I ran my fingers through my still damp hair, took 3 deep breaths to calm myself, and followed the smell of coffee coming from somewhere on the yacht. The private deck was even more impressive in daylight, with a view of the open sea stretching in all directions like an infinite blue canvas. Salvatore was sitting at an elegant lightwood table, reading some documents with the same intense concentration he probably applied to everything in his life. He didn't even look up when I approached, just turned a page with a casual movement, while I decided whether to sit or wait to be invited. I decided that waiting for an invitation from a man who had basically kidnapped me for my own protection was ridiculous. So I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without ceremony. That got his attention, and he raised his dark eyes from the documents with an arched eyebrow that suggested contained amusement. "How did you know my size?" I asked without preamble, because subtlety was never my strong suit, and I was too tired to pretend. "Marcel," he responded simply. without elaborating, and returned to the documents as if that explained absolutely everything. I waited a few seconds to see if he would continue, and when it became clear he wouldn't, I pressed. Marcel is personal assistant Marcel Dumont, delighted Mademoiselle Hampton. A man appeared out of nowhere at my side, and I jumped slightly in my chair because I hadn't heard him approach. He was French by his heavy accent, with perfectly groomed gray hair and a polite smile that didn't quite reach his observant eyes. May I offer coffee? Croissant, perhaps? We also have fresh fruit and yogurt if you prefer something lighter. Coffee, please, thank you. I responded automatically, still processing how he had appeared so silently. And croissant sounds great. Marcel nodded efficiently and disappeared as silently as he'd arrived, leaving me alone again with Salvatore and my unanswered questions. I waited until Marcel returned with an impeccable tray, served my coffee in a porcelain cup too fine to be on a yacht, and disappeared again before returning to the subject. And Marcel figured out my size how exactly? I asked, picking up the cup and feeling the comforting warmth against my fingers. Now Salvatore really looked at me, setting the documents on the table with a deliberate movement and giving me his complete attention in a way that made my stomach do a little flip. Public photos, interviews, event appearances. You wore the Valentino dress in April at the Metropolitan Charity Gala. Size 36. He said all this with the same naturalness someone would use to comment on the weather, and then returned to his documents as if having memorized such specific details about me was completely normal. An uncomfortable shiver ran down my spine, and I felt something between violation of privacy and a strange curiosity about why he would know this. That's invasive. That's efficiency, he corrected, without looking up from the paper, turning another page with long, elegant fingers. For you, maybe, but for me, I began, feeling irritation rising. Would you prefer to wake up without clothes? He cut me off, finally giving me his full attention again, and there was something in his dark eyes that made me completely forget what I was going to say. The silence stretched between us while I felt my face inevitably heat up, because he had a valid point even though I hated to admit it. No. Then, something touched the corner of his mouth, not exactly a smile but close enough to make me want to throw my coffee at him, and then he returned to the damn documents as if the conversation was over. I spent the rest of breakfast in tense silence, eating the croissant that was absurdly delicious, and trying not to think about how Salvatore Farnese apparently knew details about my life that I myself had forgotten. When I finished, I stood up without saying goodbye, and decided to explore the yacht, because sitting near him was doing strange things to my ability to think clearly. I spent the following hours wandering the luxurious corridors, discovering room after room decorated with impeccable taste and too expensive to be real. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a private movie theater, even a fully equipped gym. It was like being in a floating 6-star hotel, except I couldn't leave and the owner had admitted connections to organized crime. It was when I tried to call my family that the reality of my situation really began to weigh on me. I grabbed my phone that someone had left charging in the room, and when the screen lit up, there wasn't a single signal bar, no available Wi-Fi, absolutely nothing. I tried several times, walking around the entire yacht looking for some spot where I'd get signal, and after 10 frustrated minutes I decided I needed answers. I found Salvatore in an office at the heart of the yacht, sitting behind a massive dark mahogany desk, surrounded by computer screens and more papers than any person should have to deal with. I walked in without knocking because I was too irritated to care about etiquette. "My phone doesn't work," I announced, and my voice came out louder than intended, echoing in the elegant space. He didn't even look up from the documents he was signing, his elegant handwriting flowing across the page with practiced movements. "Yacht has signal protection. Standard security protocol. I need to call my family." I felt real frustration rising up my throat, mixed with a growing fear I was trying to ignore. "They must be desperate, thinking I died, or your family has already been notified that you're safe, under medical care, with no further details beyond that." Now he looked at me, setting down the pen with a controlled movement, and there was something calculated in that look that made me take an involuntary step back. "They know you're alive and recovering. That's all they need to know for now. You talked to them without my permission?" Indignation burned hot in my chest, because who the hell did he think he was to make decisions about my life without consulting me? "Would you prefer they thought you were dead?" The question came calmly, almost softly, but loaded with an implacable logic that stopped me mid-movement. I opened my mouth to argue, and then closed it again, because he was right, and I viscerally hated that. Hated that every point he made had perfect sense, even when I wanted him to be wrong. "No, but when we know who ordered you killed, you'll call personally and explain everything you want." He stood up, rounding the desk until he was closer, and suddenly the office seemed smaller with both of us there. Until then, minimal communication with everyone. We don't know if there's infiltration in your circle, if someone close is passing information, if your phone is compromised. I felt my legs fail at the implication of those words, and I had to lean on the edge of the desk to keep from falling right there. The wood was cold under my fingers, solid and real, anchoring me while the world seemed to spin. You think someone close to me? I think whoever planned this knew your detailed schedule, that you'd be at that specific event. At what time? Your exact position on the deck. He paused deliberately, letting each word weigh in the air between us. That requires proximity, access to information that isn't publicly available. I had to sit in the nearest chair because my legs simply couldn't hold me anymore, and the reality of those words hit me like an icy wave. My family was there, at the event. He didn't respond immediately, but his silence was more than answer enough, eloquent in a way words could never be. I saw something pass across his face, something that seemed almost compassionate before being controlled and hidden behind the mask of calculated calm he wore so well. You think it was someone in my family? I whispered, more to myself than to him, testing the words aloud and hating how they sounded too possible. I think we can't rule anyone out at this point. His voice was soft now, almost gentle, and somehow that was worse than if he'd been harsh. Investigation is still in its early stages. We're following several leads, but yes, your family is on the list of people with access and potential motive. I looked at him for the first time, without anger or indignation, just trying to understand the man in front of me who had saved my life, and was now telling me that someone I loved might have tried to kill me. Why do you care? About what happens to me? Salvatore paused, and it was the first time I'd really seen him hesitate, as if he were searching for words that didn't come easily to him. He ran his hand through his dark hair, in a gesture that seemed unconscious, messing up the already tousled strands even more, and for a second he seemed less Mafia Don and more just a tired man. I saw you fall, he said finally, his voice low and loaded with something I couldn't completely identify. And I'm not a man who watches without doing anything. I'm not a man who lets someone die when I can intervene. The explanation felt incomplete somehow, as if there were layers he wasn't saying, but before I could press for more details, he was already moving. He grabbed a glass of water from somewhere and placed it on the table beside me with a care that contrasted with the tension still present in his shoulders. Water. Drink. Fever can come back if you don't hydrate adequately. He said all this without looking me in the eyes, already turning toward the door in a movement that seemed almost like escape. Salvatore, I began, not even really knowing what I wanted to say, just feeling that he couldn't leave yet. But he was already leaving, closing the door behind him before I could finish the thought, leaving me alone in the elegant office, with more questions than answers, and a glass of water I held with trembling hands. I drank mechanically, feeling the cold liquid go down my throat, while my mind spun in circles trying to process everything. My family. Someone in my family might have tried to kill me. Aunt Margaret, who raised me after my parents died, the cousins who grew up with me, the uncles who had always been present at every birthday and graduation. One of them could have pushed me into the sea and watched while I drowned, and that possibility hurt in a way I wasn't prepared to deal with. I sat in that office for an indeterminate amount of time, staring at the empty glass in my hands and trying to breathe through the pain squeezing my chest. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a part of me registered that Salvatore Farnese had left the room before I could see whatever had crossed his face when he spoke about saving me. Chapter 3. Import Company and First Smile.
You stole my line.
Yeah.
The next day began with a restlessness that made me explore every corner of the yacht I could access, because staying locked in my room thinking about assassination attempts and family betrayals was driving me crazy. The yacht was absurdly enormous, bigger than some Manhattan apartments, with hallways that seemed to stretch infinitely, and rooms that appeared one after another like surprises in a box of excessive luxury. I passed the gym again, the library I'd already visited yesterday, a living room with a breathtaking panoramic view, and it was when I turned down a side corridor that I heard voices coming from a room with the door ajar. I should have kept going, should have respected the obvious privacy of a closed meeting, but curiosity had always been my fatal flaw, so I slowed down and paid attention. Naples shipment is confirmed for Thursday, said a male voice I didn't recognize, with an accent that sounded Italian, but softened by years living elsewhere. Transit through the port of Marseille as planned, all documentation in order, but we need a new route to Tokyo because the current one is compromised. Japanese supplier is nervous about Yakuza movement in the sector, another voice added, this one younger and tense. They're expanding territory and our contact is afraid of retaliation if he keeps doing business with foreigners. Then I heard Salvatore's voice, low and loaded with natural authority that made people obey without question. Marcel, arrange a new route through the South Pacific. Use the Sydney contacts we established last year, and tell Tanaka the guarantee is ours, that Farnese doesn't fail on delivery and won't let anything happen to him or his operation. I leaned slightly against the hallway wall, processing what I was hearing as I assembled the mental puzzle. Import company, obviously, with complex international operations involving multiple countries and elaborate transportation routes. Made sense for a wealthy family like the Farneses, with a history of maritime commerce according to what Marcel had mentioned yesterday, global businesses that required this kind of detailed logistics. The door suddenly opened, and Marcel appeared, stopping when he saw me standing there in the hallway, as if I hadn't just been caught, obviously, eavesdropping on someone else's conversation. He observed me for a second with those eyes that saw everything, and then a polite smile touched his lips as he gently closed the door behind him. "Mademoiselle Hampton," he said with that heavy French accent, tilting his head slightly in formal greeting. "May I help you with something?" "Just exploring," I responded, trying to sound casual despite having been clearly caught. "Your import company seems quite complex." Marcel blinked once, slowly, and I saw something that looked like amusement pass quickly across his face before being controlled. "Yes, very complex indeed. Global operations always are." He paused, studying my face as if deciding how much to reveal. "Mr. Farnese has another meeting shortly, but he specifically asked that I ensure you're comfortable and have everything you need. I'm great for someone who was basically kidnapped on a yacht," I responded, before I could filter myself, and then bit my lip, because antagonizing the only people around me probably wasn't a smart strategy. Marcel didn't seem offended, just amused again for that brief second. "Technically, mademoiselle, you were invited to stay for your own safety, not..." "Invited," I interrupted with a smile that had no humor in it. "Right, of course. Like when someone invites you into their car while pointing a gun." "There are no guns involved here," Marcel responded softly, and then tilted his head again before continuing down the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts about import companies and Japanese yakuza. The afternoon found me on the upper deck seeking sun and fresh air after hours inside the luxurious but claustrophobic yacht. I'd grabbed a book from the enormous library, choosing something at random from the floor-to-ceiling shelves, and was now settled in a comfortable lounge chair trying to concentrate on the printed words instead of the chaos of my life. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't hear Salvatore approach, and only noticed his presence when he simply sat on the lounge chair next to mine, without asking permission or announcing his arrival. I looked up, surprised, processing the sight of him without his suit jacket, just dress pants and a white shirt with the sleeves carefully rolled up to his elbows, showing forearms that were more muscular than I'd expect from a businessman. He looked different like this, less intimidating Mafia Don, and more just a man who'd taken a few hours off from work. His hair was even more disheveled than usual, as if he'd run his hand through it several times while dealing with whatever was in the documents he always seemed to be reading, and there was a slight shadow of stubble on his strong jaw that hadn't been there in the morning. "Do you always sit wherever you want without asking?" I asked, marking the page in the book with my finger, but not closing it completely. "Yes, it's my yacht," he responded with that irritating calm, settling in comfortably as if he belonged there, which technically was true. "It's my personal space," I argued, even knowing it was useless. Salvatore turned his face to look at me, and there was something in his dark eyes that seemed almost playful. "Do you always growl at people like this? Or am I special?" I stopped completely, the book almost slipping from my fingers as I processed those words. I had said something very similar to him yesterday when I was irritated about the blocked phone, had asked if he always controlled everything, or if it was special for me, and now he was throwing my own words back with perfect timing. "You stole my line," I accused, feeling my lips curve into something that wanted to be a smile even against my will. "Learned from the best." He paused, and then gestured lightly to the book in my hands. "What book?" I turned the cover so he could see, watching his reaction when he processed the title, The Prince by Machiavelli. "Your library, your collection choice." Something genuine passed across his face, an expression that seemed like surprise mixed with something that could be respect. "You read Machiavelli to distract yourself from assassination attempts?" "I read to understand men like you," I corrected, placing the book in my lap and turning completely to face him. "It is better to be feared than loved. Do you believe that?" The question hung in the air between us, as he observed me with that intensity that made my stomach do strange flips. The pause stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and I almost repeated the question when he finally responded. "I used to," he said, and there was weight in that word, history I didn't know, and experiences that had shaped his philosophy. "I spent a long time building an empire based on fear, on respect that came from power and capacity for retaliation. And now?" I pressed, unable to let it go even knowing I was stepping into dangerous territory. He studied me for a few more seconds before responding. "Now, I think the answer is more complicated than Machiavelli imagined when he wrote this 500 years ago. He paused, tilting his head slightly. You're not afraid of me. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. But I answered anyway. I haven't decided yet if you deserve fear. That's what broke something in him. Some invisible barrier he kept carefully in place. The smile that appeared on Salvatore Farnesi's face was slow, starting in his dark eyes before spreading to his lips. And it was absolutely devastating in a way that made me forget how to breathe for a few important seconds. It wasn't the controlled, almost smile I'd seen before, nor the polite expression he used with Marcel or in business. It was real, genuine, and it completely transformed his face from intimidating to something that could only be described as dangerously attractive. My heart did a strange thing in my chest, skipping beats and then accelerating in a way I definitely didn't want to analyze. He stood up in a fluid movement before I could fully process what had just happened, that smile still playing on his lips in a way that made my fingers tingle with the urge to do something completely inappropriate. "Dinner at 8. Don't be late," he said, already starting to walk away. "I didn't," I began, but he turned back, cutting me off with just a look. "And Miss Hampton," his voice was loaded with something I couldn't identify, but that made me want to pay attention to every word. "Machiavelli also says something about knowing your allies better than your enemies, about understanding the motivations of the people around you." He paused deliberately. "I'm an ally, and for now I'm the best one you have." He left before I could respond, leaving me alone on the deck with a book about political power and a heart beating too fast to be healthy. I looked down at the prints in my lap, at the words about fear and love and power, and wondered if Machiavelli had foreseen that 500 years later, a woman would be sitting on a yacht, trying to figure out if she was fascinated or terrified by the man keeping her there. Probably both, I finally decided, marking the page and closing the book. Definitely both. Chapter 4, Clothes, Security, and Premature Jealousy.
Are you jealous?
Are you jealous?
The days on the yacht began to establish a strange pattern I didn't know how to process, a routine that was simultaneously comfortable and unsettling in ways I wasn't prepared to analyze. Salvatore appeared at random moments of the day, sat near me without asking permission or offering explanations, sometimes talked and sometimes just stayed there, in companionable silence, before simply leaving as if nothing had happened. I tried to ignore these appearances, pretended I wasn't waiting for them, or that I didn't feel a strange anticipation when I heard footsteps approaching. I failed miserably at that, because the inconvenient truth was that I'd started to look forward to the moments when Salvatore Farnese decided to give me his attention, and that should worry me much more than it did. The morning everything changed began with a second shipment of clothes appearing in my room, carefully arranged on the bed while I was in the shower. I came out wrapped in a towel and stopped completely when I saw the absurd amount of fine, expensive fabric spread across the silk sheets. I counted twice because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "That's 12 dresses," I murmured to the empty room, touching the fabric of one of them and feeling the obvious quality under my fingers. 12 dresses and 2 coats, and this is absolutely ridiculous. I found Salvatore having coffee on the deck, as always, and marched over there still angry about the invasion of expensive clothes I hadn't asked for. He looked up when I approached, something that seemed like amusement already present in his expression, before I even opened my mouth. "Salvatore," I began, crossing my arms over my chest. "I don't need 12 dresses. Investigation will take longer than a few days," he responded calmly, setting down the tablet he was reading. "You need appropriate clothes for the time you'll be here. Not 12 dresses." My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "That's excessive even by luxury kidnapping standards." He tilted his head, and that dangerous, almost smile touched his lips. "Would you prefer to stick with just the sheet then?" I felt my face heat instantly, warmth rising up my neck to my cheeks, as memories from the first morning came back too vividly. "Stop mentioning the sheet." "As you wish," he agreed, but the smile in his dark eyes made it clear he was saving that reaction for future use. I went back to the room, still irritated but without valid arguments, and it was when I was looking at the dresses again that I really processed how perfectly each piece fit my personal style. I picked up an emerald green one specifically, holding it against my body and seeing in the mirror how the color complemented my skin tone perfectly. The fit would be impeccable, I knew without even needing to try it on, and the size was exact as always. I looked for Salvatore again, finding him in the office this time, and entered without the courtesy of knocking because apparently that had become our established dynamic. "How do you keep getting the size of everything right?" I asked without preamble, holding up the green dress as evidence. "Not just the size, but the style, the colors I like, everything. How? He looked at me for a long moment before responding, setting down the pen he was holding and giving me complete attention in a way that always made my stomach flip. I pay attention. 3 simple words that carried too much weight, and the silence that followed was loaded with something I didn't know how to name, but that made the air seem denser. I held the dress tighter, not knowing what to say, feeling something strange settling in my stomach that definitely wasn't discomfort, but that I wasn't ready to identify. "Thank you," I finally managed to say, my voice coming out softer than intended. "For the clothes. They're beautiful." He just nodded, already returning to the documents as if the conversation was over, and I left the office feeling like something important had just happened, without me fully understanding what. The afternoon found me at the yacht's pool, floating on my back in the warm water, and trying not to think about green dresses or dangerous men who paid too much attention. That's when I noticed the security team had completely changed, new faces patrolling the deck that I didn't recognize from previous days. Salvatore had replaced everyone without telling me, I realized, and I didn't know if I should be irritated by the lack of communication or impressed by the concern for security. One of the new guards was young, maybe early 20s, and I caught him looking a few times while I was swimming. It wasn't a threatening or inappropriate look, just obvious admiration from someone who clearly didn't have experience hiding his reactions. I was about to ignore it completely when Salvatore appeared out of nowhere, materializing on the deck as he always did. I watched from inside the pool as he looked at the young guard with an expression that could only be described as territorial, and the poor guy immediately coughed, turned his face away, and started studying the horizon as if it were the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. "You just intimidated your own employee," I commented, swimming to the edge and resting my arms on the warm tile, without saying a single word. Salvatore sat on the edge of the pool with fluid movements, his expensive dress pants dangerously close to the water. "I don't know what you're talking about." He looked at me for literally 2 seconds. 4, Salvatore corrected immediately, and there was something dangerous in his voice now. "And he's paid to protect you, not to admire." I processed that slowly, feeling a smile wanting to form on my lips. "Are you jealous?" "No," he responded without hesitation, but his tense jaw told a different story, because it seemed like managerial efficiency. He cut me off, and then turned to look at me directly with those intense dark eyes. "Do you want water? You must be thirsty." And I laughed. It was involuntary, escaping before I could control it, a genuine laugh that echoed across the deck, and surprised me as much as it clearly surprised him. Salvatore Farnese was jealous of a security guard in his early 20s and trying to disguise it as employee management, and it was absurd and revealing at the same time. When I looked at him again, I saw something on his face that made me stop laughing. He was watching me with an intensity that made my heart race, as if he were memorizing every detail of that moment, storing the sound of my laughter somewhere important. Dinner that night was served on the main deck, with Marcel orchestrating everything with silent efficiency, while clearly observing every interaction between me and Salvatore with poorly disguised interest. I caught him smiling to himself more than once, as if he knew a private joke that we hadn't understood yet. "Marcel," I called as he served the wine, "what's the real story of the Farnese family? Not the official version, the true one." Marcel paused, looking at Salvatore for silent permission. I saw the slight nod Salvatore gave before Marcel responded. "Family from Naples, mademoiselle, with a history going back 300 years. Marcel began with that heavy French accent. "They started with maritime trade in the Mediterranean, expanded over the centuries. Today they have various operations on multiple continents." "Various operations," I repeated, unable to hold back a smile. What an absolutely beautiful euphemism. Salvatore set down his wine glass, giving me his full attention. "Would you prefer honesty?" "Always," I responded without hesitation, leaning slightly forward. He studied me for a moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice was low but firm. "Organized crime, influence peddling, control of strategic territories in various cities, and enough legitimate businesses to sleep well at night and maintain appearances when necessary." He paused deliberately. Satisfied? I had expected denial, or at least a softened version of the truth, so the raw honesty caught me completely off guard. "You just admit that? Just like that? No beating around the bush?" "You asked for honesty," he said, leaning slightly toward me across the table. "And Valerie, you've been on my yacht for days. You already know who I am. Lying now would be an insult to your intelligence, and I don't insult intelligent people." Something warmed inside me at those words, recognition and respect wrapped in brutal honesty. "Thank you," I managed to say, "for the honesty." "You're welcome." He took a sip of wine before continuing. "And now that we've established mutual honesty, you can tell me why exactly the Hampton family went to that charity gala." The change of subject caught me off guard. "Business. Merger between Marchetti and Hampton, combining textile expertise with their global logistics. It was a celebration event for the preliminary agreement." I saw Salvatore's expression change subtly, something connecting behind those intelligent dark eyes. Marchetti. He turned to Marcel with new urgency in his voice. Marcel. Yes, boss. Marcel responded immediately, already understanding something I hadn't caught yet. Salvatore returned his attention to me, new intensity in his posture. This merger, who would benefit if it didn't happen? If it were blocked or cancelled? I processed the question slowly, feeling my stomach sink as the implications began to form. Direct competitors, companies that would lose market share with the combination. Or, I paused, not wanting to complete the thought. Or whoever would inherit my part of the company if I died before signing. Salvatore didn't respond, but his silence was deafening, confirmation of something terrible I didn't want to face. Dinner continued, but the taste of the food had turned to ashes in my mouth. As they say, sometimes silence speaks louder than 1,000 words. Our protagonist felt that firsthand now. Chapter 5: Whispers and Unbearable Proximity.
I have something important to tell you.
Speak, Valerie.
The investigation advanced in silence around me, with Marcel appearing daily in Salvatore's office carrying thick folders and reports they discussed in low voices. I'd started to notice the pattern, the way Marcel always arrived at the same time in the afternoon, how Salvatore got more tense after these meetings, how his jaw locked when he processed information he clearly didn't like. It was on the 4th day that I finally got the courage to ask directly about progress, finding Salvatore alone in the massive library, leafing through a book that looked older than most living people. He looked up when I entered, closing the volume carefully, and giving me his complete attention in a way that still made my stomach do strange flips. Any news? I asked without preamble, because subtlety was never my strong suit. About who tried to kill me. Salvatore gestured to the armchair across from his, waiting for me to sit before responding. We have 3 main names on the suspect list, all with access to your schedule, all with potential financial motive, all present at the event. I felt my heart accelerate uncomfortably. Who? Margaret Hampton is at the top. He watched me carefully as he said this, clearly assessing my reaction. Your aunt. She would inherit total control of Hampton Company if you died, considering you have no direct heirs or specific will allocating your assets otherwise. Margaret raised me, came out of my mouth immediately, defensive and desperate. After my parents died when I was 15, she took guardianship of me, gave me a home, treated me like a daughter. She wouldn't. I'm not accusing yet. Salvatore interrupted me gently. I'm investigating possibilities based on concrete facts. Motive, opportunity, access. He paused significantly. But I need to ask, Valerie, exactly how much would she inherit if you died? I didn't want to answer, didn't want to give voice to this horrible possibility, but his question demanded the honesty we'd established between us. Everything, the entire company, the Hampton name, the assets, the properties, stakes in other companies. She's my closest living relative, so in the absence of a specific will, I let the sentence die because completing it made everything too real. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to verbalize. Salvatore said nothing, just watched me process the information as I fought against the nausea rising up my throat. The afternoon found me in my room trying to make sense of all of it. Papers spread across the bed as I assembled a mental timeline of the events from that fatal night. I wrote names, times, who was where when, trying to find patterns that would explain how someone managed to push me into the sea without witnesses. I was so absorbed in the work that I didn't hear Salvatore enter, only noticed his presence when he spoke right behind me. What are you doing? I jumped slightly, turning to find him much closer than expected, observing the scattered papers with obvious interest. Have you ever heard of knocking? Yes, it's my yacht, he responded, with that irritating logic, moving even closer to get a better look at my improvised timeline. You assembled a complete chronology of the event. Interesting. I tried to concentrate on what he was saying instead of focusing on how he was too close now, practically leaning over me to examine the papers, the heat from his body perceptible even without physical contact. Yes, thinking about who knew my exact position at that specific moment. And what did you conclude? His voice was low, almost in my ear, sending shivers down my spine that I definitely shouldn't be feeling, that there were few people with that level of detailed information. I swallowed with difficulty, trying to maintain focus. Salvatore, you're too close. I'm looking at your notes, he responded reasonably, but didn't move an inch. You can see from farther away, I argued, feeling my heart race with his proximity. I can, he agreed, but continued exactly where he was, so close I could feel his breath moving my hair slightly. I turned on the stool, which was a mistake, because now we were face to face with him still leaning over me, faces separated by maybe 10 centimeters at most. Back up. Something darkened in his eyes, dangerous intensity that made my breath catch. To how many centimeters exactly? 50, I managed to say, hating how my voice came out hoarse. Minimum 50 centimeters. Salvatore backed up in a measured movement, and I watched him absurdly calculate the distance mentally before stopping exactly where I'd asked. 50 precise centimeters. And somehow that was even more disturbing than the previous proximity. Better? He asked. And there was controlled amusement in his voice now. Yes, I lied, because really nothing was better. My heart was still beating too fast, and I could still feel the ghost of his warmth. Salvatore observed the papers again, now from the safe distance I'd established. Your timeline is incomplete. Who gave you the drink? The question caught me off guard, pulling my attention back to the investigation. A waiter, but I hadn't ordered anything. He said it was courtesy of the event organizers. And who in the event organization knew you personally? He watched me make the connections, saw when the realization hit me. I felt the blood drain from my face. Margaret. She was on the organizing committee, coordinated part of the event logistics as a favor to the Marchettis. The silence that fell between us was absolute and suffocating. I saw Salvatore process this, add another piece to the horrible puzzle we were assembling together. I wanted him to say he was wrong, that there were other explanations, but he offered no false comfort. We still haven't concluded anything definitively, he said finally, but his voice carried weight that confirmed what neither of us wanted to admit aloud, but it's pointing to her. My voice came out small, broken in ways I hated. Everything is pointing to Margaret. Salvatore approached again, violating the 50 centimeters I'd established. But this time I didn't protest. He placed his hand on my shoulder, a brief but gentle touch, comforting weight that anchored me when I felt like I was going to fall apart. We still don't have conclusive proof, he said softly. We won't accuse without solid evidence. You understand? I nodded without trusting my voice to respond. His hand remained on my shoulder for a few more seconds, heat burning through the thin fabric of my blouse, before he finally pulled away. Sleep, he ordered gently, already heading toward the door. Tomorrow we continue investigating, with a clear and rested head. He left before I could respond, closing the door softly and leaving me alone with scattered papers and painful truth forming. I brought my hand to my shoulder where he had touched, feeling the ghost of the warmth still present on my skin, and slowly processed the realization that had been growing for days. I'm in trouble, I whispered to the empty room, finally admitting aloud what my heart already knew. Serious trouble. Because somewhere between the golden lamp and the perfectly chosen clothes, between the brutal honesty and the poorly disguised jealousy, between the precisely measured 50 centimeters and the gentle touch on my shoulder, I had started to fall for Salvatore Farnese, and that was possibly the most dangerous thing that could happen, considering my already complicated enough situation. At least our protagonist already admits in her thoughts that she's really falling for Salvatore. But will this story end well for her? Chapter 6. Interested Rival and 3 Languages.
You threatened him. I did not. Stop, both of you.
The yacht anchored in Monte Carlo on a sunny morning that made the Mediterranean water shine like liquid glass, and it was Marcel who informed me that Salvatore had an important business meeting during a social event that night. I would be taken along under the official pretext of protection, but by the way Marcel smiled when saying this, there were clearly more layers to the decision than just security. I spent the entire afternoon deciding what to wear, which was ridiculous considering I'd never been the type of woman who spent hours obsessing over clothes. But there I was, looking at the 12 dresses spread across the bed, as if they were an impossible puzzle to solve, until my eyes landed on the emerald green one I'd commented on with Salvatore days ago. I put it on without allowing myself to analyze why I was choosing that one specifically, telling myself it was just because the color was beautiful and the fit would be perfect. It had absolutely nothing to do with the way Salvatore's eyes had darkened slightly when I was holding the dress that day, or how he'd said he paid attention. Definitely not. When I came down to the deck where Salvatore was waiting, I saw something pass quickly across his face before being controlled and hidden behind the mask of calm he wore so well. But I had seen it. That brief second where his eyes traveled over the green dress with an intensity that made my stomach flip, and some feminine and dangerous part of me felt absurdly satisfied. The event was exactly the kind of thing I used to attend in New York. European elite circulating with expensive champagne glasses and conversations about business disguised as polite socialization. Salvatore disappeared into a closed meeting shortly after we arrived, leaving me free to circulate through the luxurious ballroom, while members of his security team watched me discreetly from afar. It was when I was admiring the view of the harbor through the enormous windows that I felt a presence beside me, and I turned to find a man I didn't know watching me with obvious interest. He was older than Salvatore, maybe mid-40s, with blonde hair and light blue eyes that seemed cold even when he smiled. Miss Hampton, he said with a pronounced Russian accent, taking my hand before I could decide if I wanted to offer it. What a happy surprise to find you here. I heard you were indisposed recently. Recovered, thank you, I responded politely, trying to pull my hand back, but he held it for an uncomfortably long time. More than recovered, he continued, finally releasing my hand only to raise it to his lips, the kiss lingering seconds longer than would be appropriate. May I say you look absolutely stunning tonight. Thank you, I repeated, taking a discreet step back and creating space between us. Alexei Volkov, he introduced himself with a smile that probably worked on many women, but only made me uncomfortable. May I show you the balcony? The view of the harbor at sunset is absolutely spectacular, and it would be a crime not to share it with someone so beautiful. She's already seen it. The voice came from behind me, low and loaded with something dangerous that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Salvatore had appeared out of nowhere, materializing at my side with the same silent skill he always demonstrated, and his hand found my back in a touch so light it barely existed, but was impossible not to feel. His presence was territorial in ways that should irritate me, but instead sent a strange warmth spreading through my stomach. Alexei recognized Salvatore immediately, and I saw his entire posture change in a matter of seconds, the social predator backing down before something much more dangerous. Farnese, I didn't know you knew Miss Hampton. I know her very well, Salvatore responded, and the smile that accompanied those words was slow and absolutely threatening. Alexei, come stano gli affari a Mosca? Kak tvoj dela? How's business? 3 languages in one sentence, each word loaded with subtext that even I could pick up. Italian flowing into Russian and ending in English. All the questions meaning the same thing, but the progression making absolutely clear that Salvatore knew exactly who he was talking to and what kind of business Alexei conducted. Well, Alexei responded, the word coming out tense. Prosperous as always. It was a pleasure, Miss Hampton. He disappeared into the crowd so quickly it almost seemed like escape, and I turned to Salvatore with indignation already burning in my chest. You threatened him. I asked about business. He responded with absolutely false innocence, his hand still present on my back. In 3 different languages, I pointed out, crossing my arms, because apparently threatening in just one wasn't enough. Italian, Russian, and English, he confirmed calmly, to guarantee the message would be completely understood. You can't just threaten every man who talks to me, I protested, even feeling something dangerously close to satisfaction with his possessiveness. Salvatore looked at me directly, without looking away, or softening the intensity. I can. I'm just being polite so far. I stopped completely, processing those words while trying to decide if I was horrified or fascinated. This is being polite? Alexei Volkov is still standing with all his teeth intact, he pointed out reasonably. Yes, it's polite by my standards. Horror and fascination simultaneously, I decided, observing his face and trying to understand how a man could make veiled threats sound like normal conversation. You're impossible. And yet, he said, his voice dropping slightly as something changed in his expression. You're wearing the green dress. I felt heat rise up my face instantly, caught red-handed in something I hadn't even fully admitted to myself. It's comfortable. The smile that touched his lips was small but devastating, knowledge and satisfaction mixed in an irritating way. Of course it is. He offered his arm in an old-fashioned but elegant gesture. Dinner is being served. You need to eat. I hesitated only a second before accepting his arm, feeling the solid muscles under the expensive suit as he guided me through the ballroom. On the other side of the room, I saw Marcel watching with an amused expression, and beside him was a woman I didn't recognize but who clearly knew Salvatore by the familiar way she smiled. She extended her hand, and Marcel placed something in it that looked suspiciously like money. Marcel just paid up on a bet, I commented, nodding discreetly in their direction. Salvatore followed my gaze and something that looked like resignation passed briefly across his face. My sister Isis, she bet you'd wear the green dress today. And won, I observed, not knowing if I should be embarrassed or amused. What exactly did you bet? You're better off not knowing, he responded, guiding me to the reserved table. Trust me.
Jerusalem, your heart is racing.
Chapter 7, Almost Kiss and Wordless Confession. The night after the event in Monte Carlo found me on the yacht's deck under a starry sky that seemed infinite. Points of light scattered across the deep black in ways I could never see in New York, with all the city's light pollution. The yacht swayed gently, anchored somewhere between the French and Italian coast, and the air was warm enough to be comfortable without a jacket. I'd been alone for maybe 20 minutes when I heard footsteps approaching, and I didn't even need to turn to know who it was. I'd started to recognize the sound of Salvatore's walk, the specific rhythm of his steps, the way he moved with absolute confidence even in the dark. He stopped beside me at the railing without saying anything, resting his forearms on the polished wood, and looking at the same dark horizon I was watching. I noticed peripherally that he'd removed his jacket and tie, was just in dress pants and a white shirt with the first buttons open and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked different like this, less intimidating mafia don, and more just a tired man at the end of a long day. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. 5 full minutes passed without either of us saying a word, just existing in the same space while the yacht swayed gently and the stars turned slowly overhead. It was strange how this silence seemed more intimate than any conversation, how simply being near him had become something natural. "Why don't you sleep?" I finally asked, my voice low so as not to break the peace of the night. "How do you know I don't sleep?" He turned his face slightly to look at me, curious. "You always show up in the middle of the night," I pointed out, gesturing vaguely to the space around us. "Here, on the deck, when you should be sleeping. Insomnia?" Salvatore stayed quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer, and then let out a small sigh. "Always have. Mine doesn't stop. Never really has." "What do you think about when you're awake at 3 in the morning?" I felt genuine curiosity, wanting to understand the man beside me better. He turned completely to face me now, leaning his hip against the railing while studying me with that intensity that always made me forget how to breathe. "Lately, you." The word came out so simple, so honest, that it took a full second to fully process. My heart did a strange jump in my chest, and I felt heat rising up my neck despite the night breeze. "You're not asking why?" He tilted his head, observing my reaction with attention that should make me uncomfortable, but instead made me want to move closer. "I'm afraid of the answer," I admitted, turning also to face him. Our bodies now mirrored, leaning against the railing, sea at our backs, and too little space between us. "Why?" The question came soft, almost whispered. "Because I understand," I responded, feeling the words coming out before I could filter them. "You show up in my thoughts too with concerning frequency, and I hate it. I hate it because you're exactly the type of man I promised myself to avoid. Controlling. Who decides for me? Who rearranges my life without asking first? I saved you," he began, but I cut him off. "I know you saved me, and that's what makes everything so complicated." I ran my hand through my hair. Frustrated. My ex-fiancé was controlling. He thought loving me meant controlling me, that taking care of me gave him the right to make all the decisions. And I paused, taking a deep breath, and I swore I'd never let anyone do that again. Salvatore stayed quiet for a long moment before responding, his voice lower than before. "I'm not him. You changed my entire security team without consulting me," I enumerated, raising a finger, blocked my phone without permission, chose my clothes, decided where I stay, who I can talk to protect you," he interrupted me, pushing off from the railing and taking a step in my direction, closing the space between us to maybe half a meter. "Not to trap you. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" I challenged, crossing my arms even knowing it was an obvious defensive gesture. "From where I'm standing, it looks very similar." The pause that followed was loaded with something dense and important, and I saw Salvatore process the question with the seriousness it deserved. When he finally responded, there was weight in every word. "The difference is that when you tell me to leave, when you say you don't want my protection or my presence anymore, I'll go." He took another step, now close enough that I could see the golden flecks in his dark eyes under the starlight. "Without questioning, without trying to convince you otherwise, without making you feel guilty about the choice, I'll simply go." He paused deliberately. Would he? The question hit me like a punch to the stomach because the answer was so obvious and painful. No, he'd stay, argue, make me feel like I was being irrational or overreacting. "Then I'm not him," Salvatore repeated, softer now. We stood like that for seconds that seemed to stretch eternally, looking at each other while the yacht swayed under our feet, and the world seemed to reduce to just this deck, this night, this moment. I saw when his hands started to rise slowly, fingers extending toward my face, and then stopped maybe 2 centimeters from my cheek. "May I?" he asked, voice hoarse, and the fact that he was asking permission when he could simply take what he wanted broke something inside me. I didn't respond, didn't deny, just stood paralyzed between wanting and being afraid, between moving closer and pulling back. My heart screamed yes, while my head desperately tried to find reasons to say no. The yacht creaked suddenly, a wave larger than the others hitting the hull and making the surface under my feet move abruptly. I lost my balance, arms extending automatically, searching for support, and then Salvatore caught me. His arms closed around me firm and secure, pulling me against his chest, while the wave passed and the yacht stabilized again. I stayed there for seconds that seemed suspended in time, face pressed against his white shirt, breathing in the scent of something expensive and masculine mixed with sea salt. That's when I heard his heart beating too fast against my ear, accelerated in a way that didn't match the calm of his posture. He was affected too, I realized with surprise, as affected as I was. "Are you okay?" His voice came out hoarse, vibrating in the chest where my face was still pressed. I didn't pull away immediately, lingering a few more seconds in that embrace before finally taking a step back. Yes, I placed my hand over my own chest, feeling my racing heart. Your heart is racing. Unexpected waves, he responded too quickly, voice controlled, but not completely steady. Natural reaction to potentially dangerous situations. I looked at him, at his face illuminated only by stars, and felt a small smile touching my lips. Of course, completely natural reaction. We both knew it was a blatant lie, but neither of us called the other out, letting the falsehood hang between us like tacit acknowledgement of what was happening, of what had almost happened. Chapter 8. Isis arrives and the truth about Margaret.
It was her.
The sound of the helicopter cut through the morning silence before I even saw it, the rotating blades creating an unmistakable noise that echoed over the calm water. I was having coffee on the deck when the aircraft appeared on the horizon, black and elegant against the blue sky, approaching the yacht with the precision of an experienced pilot. Salvatore appeared beside me almost immediately, and I noticed the tension in his shoulders relax slightly when he saw the helicopter. "Who is it?" I asked, having to speak louder because of the noise from the blades, as the helicopter began its landing maneuver on the helipad at the rear of the yacht. "My sister," he responded, and there was something in his tone I'd never heard before, softer, almost affectionate. "Isis. She's bringing the final results of the investigation." The helicopter landed with the precision of a procedure practiced thousands of times, and when the blades began to decelerate, the door opened, revealing a woman who was clearly related to Salvatore. She had the same intense dark eyes, the same black hair that shone under the morning sun, the same presence that commanded attention just by existing. But where Salvatore was all rigid control and contained power, she moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never had to prove anything to anyone. Isis Farnese wore an impeccably tailored suit that screamed successful international lawyer, high heels that made determined sounds against the deck as she walked straight to her brother. Salvatore moved to meet her halfway, and I watched with fascination when he simply pulled her into a tight hug, the gesture so natural and unreserved that it made me realize this was probably the only person in the world with whom he completely lowered all defenses. They separated after a few seconds, and that's when her eyes found mine over Salvatore's shoulder. Something that looked like quick assessment and approval passed across her face before we were even formally introduced. And then she was walking in my direction, with the same determination she'd used to approach her brother. "This is her?" Isis asked, but was clearly talking to Salvatore even while looking directly at me. "Isis, this is..." Salvatore began, but his sister was already extending her hand in my direction with a genuine smile. "Isis Farnese, sister of the world's most complicated man," she introduced herself, and the Italian accent was more pronounced than Salvatore's, as if she'd spent more time recently in Italy. "You must be the reason he canceled 3 important meetings and developed even worse insomnia than usual." I laughed before I could control myself, her brutal honesty catching me completely off guard in good ways. "Valerie Hampton, nice to finally meet you. I know who you are," Isis responded, shaking my hand with a firmness that spoke of absolute confidence. Then she turned to her brother with an expression that clearly said she wanted privacy. "She's great. You have good taste for the first time in your life. Now go. Adults need to talk." "I'm not going anywhere." Salvatore began to protest, but Isis just waved her hand dismissing him. "Go. We have women's business to discuss." She made an imperious gesture that probably worked on everyone in her life. "Marcel needs you to sign the documents for the Tokyo shipment anyway." Salvatore looked at me as if checking whether I was comfortable being left alone with his sister, and I felt a strange warmth in my chest at the obvious concern. I nodded slightly, and he left with visible reluctance, looking back once before disappearing down the stairs. Isis waited until we had absolute certainty that he was gone before gesturing to the comfortable chairs on the deck, sitting with the elegance of someone who'd grown up in luxury environments. "You know he's not the villain of this story, right?" The direct question caught me off guard, and it took me a second to formulate a response. "I know he saved my life, that he's protecting me when he had no obligation to. Do you know he spent the entire night by your bedside when you had a fever?" Isis watched me carefully, clearly assessing my reaction. "Didn't even sleep. Just stayed there in the uncomfortable chair in the room, monitoring your temperature, talking quietly with the doctor every half hour. Not once did he leave until you were stable." I felt something tighten in my chest, processing information that Salvatore clearly would never mention voluntarily. "I didn't know that." "He wasn't going to tell you," Isis confirmed with a small smile. "Salvatore is a product of a brutal world that doesn't allow displays of weakness, so he hides everything he feels like it's a state secret." She paused, looking at the sea before returning her attention to me. Our father died when Salvatore was 15. I was 9. He took over everything that day, the entire family, the business, the responsibility of raising me and keeping the Farnese empire running. I listened in silence, beginning to understand the layers of the man who had saved me. He never complained once, Isis continued, her voice loaded with obvious fraternal love. Never asked for help, never allowed himself to show that it was too much weight for a teenager to carry. He did everything for me, to guarantee I'd have a normal life, education, choices he never had. She paused significantly, and never, in all these years, has he allowed himself to want something just for himself, until now. Isis, I began, but she raised her hand gently, interrupting me. You don't need to decide anything today. Don't need to give me answers or make promises, she said softly. I just wanted you to see him, really see who Salvatore is underneath all the layers he's built. And Valerie, she leaned slightly forward, her voice becoming more serious. The investigation. We have a problem. The atmosphere changed instantly, all the warmth from the previous conversation evaporating as Isis opened the leather folder she'd brought from the helicopter. I felt my stomach tighten in anticipation, knowing that whatever was in those documents was going to change everything. We traced the payment that hired the man who pushed you, Isis began, pulling out documents and spreading them on the table between us. It was elaborate, layers upon layers of fake accounts and shell companies designed to be impossible to trace. She paused, looking at me directly, but we managed anyway. The final shell account, the one that originated all the money, belongs to a holding company in the Cayman Islands, and that holding company belongs to... She paused, letting the silence stretch, and I felt as if the world had stopped spinning completely. Margaret Hampton, I finished for her, my voice coming out as a hoarse whisper, as the last hope I desperately held on to shattered. Isis nodded silently, her expression compassionate but firm. There was no pity in her eyes, just recognition of inevitable pain. I sat heavily in the chair, feeling my legs unable to support me anymore, as I processed what this meant. She raised me, the words came out broken, loaded with all the accumulated pain of the last few days. After my parents died in that car accident, after I was orphaned at 15, Margaret took me in, gave me a home, family, love, or at least I thought it was love. The office door opened, and Salvatore entered with the perfect timing of someone who'd been listening, or who simply knew when he was needed. He didn't say anything, just walked to where I was, and sat in the chair beside me, close enough that I could feel his solid presence, but without touching me, just offering silent support. Why? The question came out small, vulnerable in ways I hated. Why would she do this? Isis exchanged a quick look with her brother before responding, and it was Salvatore who spoke. Inheritance and control of the company, as we suspected. But there's more. He pulled another document from the folder. The merger with the Marchettis. If you die before signing the final agreement, Margaret inherits everything and can block the merger completely. And we discovered that Marchetti has a parallel agreement with her. Secret. That would be much more advantageous for both if you were out of the way. I felt nausea rising, the betrayal being much worse than I'd imagined. She waited for the right moment, the public event, the perfect opportunity to make it look like an accident. Drunk socialite falls into the sea during party, Salvatore continued, his voice low but firm. No one would question it, just a regrettable tragedy, except you weren't drunk, and I saw what happened. Why were you looking at me? The question came out before I could filter it, and when I looked at him, I saw something pass quickly across his face. The pause before the answer was long, loaded, and when Salvatore finally spoke, there was brutal honesty in the words. Because you were the most interesting person at the entire event. I'd been watching for a while before the incident. How long? I pressed, needing to know. Long enough to notice when someone approached from behind, he admitted, and the weight of those words hit me completely. He hadn't saved me by chance or opportunity. He was paying attention, specifically to me, before anything even happened. Salvatore, I began, but he stood up abruptly. I'll deal with Margaret. We have enough evidence now, he said, already moving toward the door with that determination I'd learned to recognize. I grabbed his wrist before thinking, my hand closing around the warm skin, and he stopped instantly as if he'd hit an invisible wall. With me, I insisted, my voice firmer than I felt. I deal with this with me, but teach me how. Show me what to do. Salvatore looked at my hand on his wrist for a long moment, and then his eyes rose to meet mine, something intense burning in those dark depths. Okay. Together then. The word hung between us like a promise and recognition of a partnership that had formed without either of us fully realizing when. It wasn't just protector and protected anymore. It was something more. Something I wasn't ready to name yet, but that I felt growing every day. Chapter 9. Confrontation with Margaret and Explosion.
Why did you do it? I did what was necessary. Was it?
The plan was assembled on Salvatore's office table with the precision of a military operation, every detail discussed and analyzed until we were certain nothing could go wrong. I would call Margaret, keep my voice controlled and normal, say I was recovering and wanted to see her. Salvatore would be beside me during the call, monitoring every word, every reaction of hers through the speakerphone. I picked up the phone with my hands trembling slightly and felt Salvatore's presence move closer, staying close enough that the warmth of his body was comforting, but not invasive. I took 3 deep breaths before finally dialing the number I knew by heart, the number of the woman who had raised me and who apparently had tried to kill me. "Valerie!" Margaret's voice came too loud, too relieved, false in ways I never would have noticed before, but that were now obvious. "My God, darling, where are you? We've all been desperate." "Aunt," I managed to say, keeping my voice steady despite everything. "I'm fine. Recovering. I had an accident, but I'm being taken care of." "Accident?" She repeated the word with concern that sounded too practiced. "What happened?" "No one could tell us anything. I can explain in person," I responded, following the script we'd prepared. "Can I see you tomorrow? I need to talk to you about some things." Of course, darling." The answer came too quickly, too eagerly. "Do you want me to come to where you are? Where are you exactly?" I noticed the question, the way she tried to seem casual, but there was real urgency behind the words. "I'll come to you. It's easier. Tomorrow morning at your apartment. Is that okay?" "Perfect. I'll be waiting. I'll be here all day." Brief pause. "I'm so relieved you're okay, Valerie." "So relieved." I hung up and stared at the phone in my hand as if it were an alien object. Salvatore remained quiet beside me, waiting for me to process, and then I spoke aloud the realization that had hit me during the conversation. "She didn't ask where I was," I whispered, raising my eyes to meet his. "Not once in the entire conversation did she ask my location, where I'm staying, who I'm with. Nothing." "No," Salvatore agreed softly. "She didn't. Because she knew I should be in the ocean," I completed, feeling the realization hurt physically in my chest, or dead at the bottom of the sea. She didn't expect me to be alive to answer this call. The next morning came too fast and too slow at the same time, and I found myself in the back seat of Salvatore's luxury car, on the way to Margaret's apartment in Manhattan. His security team followed in a separate vehicle, discreet but present, and Salvatore was beside me in the back seat wearing a tiny microphone hidden in the lapel of the blazer I was wearing. "You don't have to do this," he said for the 3rd time, his voice low and loaded with real concern. "I can have the team handle everything. You don't need to expose yourself like this." "I need to," I responded, looking out the window as the city passed by. "I need to hear it from her mouth, need to understand why. I need closure before I can move forward." Margaret's apartment was exactly as I remembered, decorated with impeccable taste and full of family photos that now seemed like elaborate lies. She opened the door before I even knocked, pulling me into a tight hug that made my stomach turn with the obvious falseness. "My dear girl," she murmured, holding my face between her hands and studying my eyes as if she really cared. "What a scare you gave us. What happened exactly?" I entered the apartment, feeling the weight of the microphone on my lapel, and knowing Salvatore was listening to every word from the car discreetly parked on the street. "Someone pushed me into the sea during the party, Aunt. Pushed me on purpose." I saw the mask slip for a fraction of a second before Margaret recomposed her expression into appropriate shock. "Pushed? It wasn't an accident? But who would do something like that?" "I was hoping you could tell me," I responded, keeping my voice calm despite my heart beating uncontrollably. "Considering the payment to the man who pushed me was traced back to you, the silence that fell in the apartment was absolute and suffocating." I watched Margaret process the words, saw the exact moment she realized she'd been caught, when the mask of concerned aunt fell completely revealing the cold and calculating woman underneath. "You shouldn't have survived," she said finally, her voice completely different now, devoid of any affection. "It was planned perfectly, executed without flaws. How did you survive?" The confirmation hurt more than I'd anticipated. Even knowing the truth, hearing her admit it so casually ripped the air from my lungs. "Why? You raised me after my parents died." "I raised you as an investment," Margaret responded with a coldness that made me take a step back. "Your father was my brother, but left absolutely everything to you. Not to me, his own sister who helped build the Hampton Empire from the beginning. 20 years taking care of you, sacrificing my life. And for what? To watch you inherit everything while I get crumbs? You could have asked, talked, negotiated," I began, but she cut me off with a bitter laugh. "I asked. For years I asked your father to include me, give me the recognition I deserved. But no, his perfect little daughter would inherit everything." She spat the words with decades of accumulated venom. "And you were going to be exactly the same, spoiled little heiress who never worked a day in her life. So you decided to kill me," I completed, my voice coming out firmer now. "It was that simple? I die in the ocean. Looks like a drunk socialite's accident and you get everything?" "Exactly," Margaret confirmed without any remorse. "Quick, Clean, no suspicions, until you showed up alive and ruined everything. The apartment door opened, and Salvatore's team entered with silent efficiency. Two large men who made Margaret instinctively back up. She looked at them, then at me, and I saw when she fully understood. "You recorded everything," she whispered, the realization hitting. "I learned from good people," I responded, already turning to the door, unable to stay in the same environment as her any longer. "Goodbye, Aunt Margaret." I left without looking back, going down the stairs because I couldn't wait for the elevator, needing air and space and distance from that woman. Salvatore's car was waiting, and when I got in the back seat, he was already there, having predicted I would need him immediately. I was shaking, my entire body trembling with tremors I couldn't control, but the tears wouldn't come. Just the tremors, wave after wave as I processed what had just happened. I felt Salvatore's hand take mine, fingers intertwining with gentle firmness, and that simple touch was the anchor that kept me from completely falling apart. "She raised me," I managed to say after minutes in silence. "I know," Salvatore responded quietly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of my hand. "And during all those years, all the birthdays and graduations and achievements, she was just waiting for the right moment to kill me. It's not your fault," he said, with a conviction that cut through the pain. "The people who hurt us most are the ones we trust most, but the fault is always theirs, never ours for trusting." Something broke inside me at those words, and I laughed. It was involuntary, hysterical, coming out mixed with a sob that could be crying but wasn't. "I started our relationship trying to hit you with a golden lamp." Salvatore laughed too, a real deep sound that echoed in the car. "I'll never forget that lamp. The absolute determination on your face." I looked at him through the tears that were finally starting to fall, and he raised his hand, his thumb wiping away a tear running down my cheek. The hand remained there, warm against my face, and we both knew the moment had finally arrived. Chapter 10. When it explodes, its killer night fell over the yacht. With that special quietness that comes only when danger has finally passed, when the threat hanging over your head has been eliminated, and the air seems lighter, even carrying the weight of everything lost in the process. Margaret was in custody of the appropriate authorities. The evidence we recorded was irrefutable, and for the first time in weeks I could breathe without feeling constant fear on the back of my neck. I was on the deck, looking at the horizon where the lights of New York were beginning to shine in the distance, the city that was my home seeming simultaneously close and belonging to another life completely. The yacht was anchored near enough that I could see the outlines of familiar buildings, but far enough that I still felt separated from all of it. I heard Salvatore's footsteps before seeing him, the familiar sound I'd learned to recognize and expect, and when he appeared beside me, he was carrying 2 glasses of red wine that gleamed under the soft light of the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Are you taking me back?" I asked without preamble, accepting the glass he offered, and feeling his fingers brush mine briefly in the exchange. "To the city? To my normal life?" Salvatore leaned against the railing beside me, looking at the same horizon I was watching. "When you want to go, I'll take you. And if I don't want to yet?" The words came out low, loaded with meaning. Neither of us was pretending not to understand. "If I'm not ready to go back to that life, then you stay here," he responded simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "For as long as you need, for as long as you want." "Until when?" I pressed, turning to face him now, needing to see his face when he answered. "Until when exactly can I stay on your yacht, in your life, occupying your space?" "Valerie." He said just my name, and there was something in the tone that made my heart race. I responded, holding the wineglass tighter than necessary. "Stop asking questions you already know the answer to." His voice was low, almost hoarse, loaded with emotions he normally kept locked behind all the rigid control. The silence that fell between us was dense and loaded, full of everything that hadn't been said during the weeks we spent together, all the almost confessions and interrupted moments and looks that lasted seconds too long. I placed the wineglass on the nearby table without drinking even a sip, turning completely to face him. "I need to hear it," I insisted, keeping my eyes fixed on his even feeling too exposed vulnerability. "I'm like this, always have been. I need words said out loud, not just gestures or implications. I need to hear you say it." I saw the struggle happen on his face, the man accustomed to silences and actions being forced to verbalize feelings he'd probably never put into words before. He set down his own glass beside mine, ran his hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized as rare nervousness, and then finally began to speak. "You entered my life as a problem," he began, his voice low but firm. person in danger who needed immediate protection. And I didn't think twice before acting because it was the right thing to do. He paused, searching for the right words. And then you woke up and grabbed the golden lamp as a weapon, and something changed completely. I waited in silence, barely able to breathe as I watched him struggle to continue. You became the only thing I want to protect, he continued, and there was growing intensity in his voice now. Not out of duty or obligation or because it's morally right, but because when you're not in my field of vision, I look for you. Automatically, without thinking, as if it were an unconscious reflex. And that's never happened before, with anyone in my entire life. I felt tears beginning to burn in my eyes, but didn't let them fall yet, not wanting to miss a single word of what he was saying. I love you, Salvatore finally said, the 3 words coming out like a forced confession. In an inconvenient and premature and completely out of my control way. And I hate being out of control. You know that. I hate the feeling of not having complete command over the situation. But with you, he paused, looking directly into my eyes. With you, I'm constantly out of control, and somehow that doesn't scare me as much as it should. Happy now? The tears finally fell, but they were good ones, loaded with relief and happiness and recognition of something I'd felt growing, but had been afraid to name. Yes, I managed to say through the lump in my throat. Very happy. I took a deep breath, wiping the tears with the back of my hand before continuing. I love you too. I started falling from that moment in the office when you said that if I told you to leave, you'd simply go, without questioning, without making me feel guilty. I paused, letting the next words carry all the weight they deserved. No man has given me real choice before. They all said they loved me while taking away my autonomy. But you offered me power over the situation even when you clearly wanted to stay. Salvatore abandoned the wine glasses completely, taking a determined step in my direction, and closing the distance between us until we were separated by only centimeters. You always have it, he said with absolute conviction. Choice, autonomy, decision-making power. With me, you always have it. Always. And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle or hesitant or exploratory in a timid way. It was an explosion of weeks of accumulated tension, of almost touches and loaded looks and proximity that had never been completed until now. His hand found my face, fingers sliding through my hair, while his other hand pulled my waist, bringing me even closer until there was no space at all between our bodies. I grabbed his shirt with both hands, holding the expensive fabric with enough force to wrinkle it but not caring one bit, just needing an anchor while the world spun around me. The kiss was intense in ways that made my heart race and my breath fail, but there was care too, attention in the way he held my face, as if I were something precious. When we finally separated out of necessity for air, it was just enough to breathe, foreheads still pressed against each other as we tried to catch our breath. I could feel his breath against my lips, fast and uneven in a way that matched mine. "Took you long enough," I managed to say, my voice coming out hoarse and broken. "I know," he responded, his thumb tracing a gentle line along my cheek. 3 different languages to threaten a man in Monte Carlo, but you couldn't tell me you loved me?" I teased, feeling a smile wanting to form on my still tingling lips from the kiss. Salvatore laughed, a low, genuine sound that vibrated in his chest. Ironically, yes, completely pathetic on my part. "Very pathetic," I agreed, still holding his shirt. "Shut up," he murmured, and then kissed me again. Quicker this time, but no less intense, effective in silencing any other teasing I might have prepared. When we separated again, we stood there under the stars with New York shining in the distance, and for the first time in weeks, I felt I was exactly where I should be. Chapter 11. Choice and Their World.
This is my decision.
The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of lawyers, endless meetings, and decisions about the future of Hampton Company that was now completely under my control, with Margaret officially removed and awaiting trial. I returned to New York because I needed to be physically present to handle everything, to assume the place that was mine by right, but that I'd never really occupied until now. Salvatore was by my side throughout the entire process, but in a different way than I would have expected. He didn't try to control or direct my decisions, didn't offer unsolicited advice, or try to take command of the situation. He was simply present when I wanted, available when I needed, and disappeared silently when I needed space to think alone. It was a delicate balance I didn't know was possible, having someone so present but not invasive, so protective but not suffocating. And the more time I spent with him, the more I understood that this was Salvatore's way of loving, giving space and presence in equal measures. It was during one of those afternoons that I found Isis in the waiting room of the law office, where we were finalizing the last legal details. She was sitting elegantly leafing through a business magazine, and when she saw me, she smiled in a way that suggested she knew exactly what I was going to ask. "Has he always been like this?" I asked without preamble, sitting beside her. "Reading what people need before they even know themselves?" Isis lowered the magazine, studying me with those dark Farnese eyes that saw everything. "With you? Yes. From day one. With anyone else in his life? No, never. She paused, tilting her head. Salvatore built an entire empire based on reading people, understanding motivations, anticipating moves. But that was always calculated. Strategic, a business tool. She paused significantly. With you, it's different. With you, he simply knows because he truly pays attention. The words stayed with me during the following days, echoing in my head as I prepared for the most important meeting of my professional life. The merger with the Marchettis was still on the table, but I'd spent the last few weeks studying every detail of the original agreement Margaret had negotiated, and I'd found loopholes and imbalances that favored the Marchettis in absurd ways. The conference room was full of executives when I entered, all older men who watched me with a mixture of curiosity and poorly disguised condescension. I recognized those looks. Had seen them my whole life, the automatic judgment that came from being young and female and an heiress instead of someone who built an empire from scratch. Gentlemen, I began, opening the thick folder I'd prepared and placing it on the polished table. I've reviewed the proposed terms for the Hampton-Marchetti merger, and I have some substantial changes that need to be implemented before any agreement is signed. I saw eyebrows raise, saw the look exchanged between some executives who clearly expected I would simply sign what Margaret had negotiated. I spent the next hour methodically dismantling each unfavorable clause, presenting counter-proposals that balanced the power and guaranteed that Hampton Company maintained adequate autonomy even after the merger. When I finished, I closed the folder with a definitive movement and looked around the table. Any questions about the new terms? The silence that followed was absolute, loaded with surprise and reluctant respect. They had completely underestimated the socialite who appeared in society columns, and now they were processing that this same woman had just renegotiated the entire agreement on much more favorable terms for Hampton. "No questions, Miss Hampton," the Marchetti CEO said finally, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "The new terms are acceptable." I returned to my office in the Hampton building feeling a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction, and it was when I was organizing the documents on the desk that I heard the door open without prior knocking announcing it. I didn't even need to look to know who it was. "You know how to knock," I commented without looking up from the papers. "I do," Salvatore responded, and I heard amusement in his voice. "I don't like to." Brief pause. How did it go? I finally looked up, finding him leaning against the doorframe with that casual elegance that made it seem like he belonged in any space he occupied. "Well, they completely underestimated me. Expected I would just sign whatever they put in front of me." I smiled small. Their mistake. Something passed across Salvatore's face, an expression that could only be described as pure, unfiltered pride. Yes, definitely their mistake. I stood up, rounding the desk to get closer to him, feeling the shift in the air between us that always happened when we decreased the physical distance. "And you? How are your businesses?" "Resolved and stable," he responded, but there was tension in his shoulders that suggested there was something more. "Valerie, I need to ask you something." I felt my stomach tighten slightly at the seriousness in his tone. "Ask." Salvatore pushed off from the doorframe, walking until he was directly in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to maintain eye contact. "My world. You've seen everything now, the real and the ugly, the danger that comes with being close to me, the complexity of the business I conduct, the morally ambiguous choices I sometimes need to make." I waited in silence, feeling the importance of the moment hanging between us. "I can't promise you it will be simple," he continued, his voice low but firm. "I can't guarantee complete safety all the time. I can't promise that my life won't bring complications to yours. But I can promise that you'll never be alone navigating through it, and that your choices will always be yours. Always, without exception." He paused, looking straight into my eyes. "Do you want this? Want me and everything that comes with me? With full awareness of what you're choosing?" I thought about the yacht and the golden lamp I'd held as a weapon, about the perfectly chosen clothes, the 3 languages used to ward off a rival, the hand holding mine in the car after the confrontation with Margaret. I thought about how he'd always given me choice, how he'd never tried to control even when he clearly wanted to protect. "I want you," I responded without hesitation, placing my hands on his chest and feeling the heart beating steadily under my palms. With full awareness of every complication, every danger, every difficult choice, I want all of it because it means having you. Salvatore pulled me into a kiss that stole all the air from my lungs, intense and deep, and loaded with the promise of a future we were choosing together. When we separated, I heard a muffled sound from the hallway and contained laughter. "Marcel," Salvatore murmured against my lips, "is betting again with Isis." "And who won this time?" I asked, smiling. Considering they bet on when I'd finally ask officially, he smiled too. "Isis. Always Isis." Chapter 12. Ending. The lamp on the wall.
You kept the lamp.
I did. It always reminded me of you.
I'm glad.
A year later, the penthouse I'd bought in Manhattan was full of voices and laughter, the kind of intimate party that was luxurious but welcoming at the same time, with the right people instead of simply many people. The panoramic windows showed the illuminated city below, New York shining as it always did at night, and I circulated among the guests feeling something that could only be described as deep contentment. Hampton Company had flourished under my leadership over the past year. The merger with the Marchettis had been completed on my terms, and was generating the results I'd predicted, and for the first time in my life, I felt I was exactly where I should be, doing exactly what I should be doing. I was no longer just the Hampton heiress who appeared in society columns. I was the Hampton CEO who appeared in business sections. It was when I saw Isis entering through the door that I noticed something different in her posture, an almost radiant happiness that made my attention immediately focus. And then I saw Marcel right behind her, his hand landing briefly on her back in a gesture that was simultaneously possessive and protective, and the realization hit me like lightning. "You too," I managed to say when I approached, looking between Isis and Marcel with growing surprise. "You're together?" Isis smiled in that way that illuminated her entire face, taking Marcel's hand and intertwining their fingers in a way that made it absolutely clear this wasn't new. For 6 months, actually. We wanted to keep it private at first, see if it was real before announcing it to the world. 6 months! I immediately turned looking for Salvatore in the room, finding him talking with some investors near the window. I marched over there with determination, interrupting the conversation without ceremony. "You knew?" Salvatore looked at me with that expression I already knew so well, the one he used when he knew exactly what I was talking about, but was going to feign innocence anyway. "Knew what exactly?" "About Isis and Marcel." I crossed my arms, trying to seem irritated despite being more amused than anything else. "How long have you known?" 3 months, he admitted without hesitation, because honesty between us had become absolute over the past year. "Marcel told me, and asked me to keep it secret until they were ready to tell publicly. I respect secrets when they're asked of me." "You should have told me," I protested, even knowing he'd done the right thing by respecting their request for privacy. Salvatore took my hand, pulling me slightly closer with a movement that seemed natural after a year together. "Marcel trusted me with sensitive information. I wasn't going to break that trust even for you." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. "But now that they've told, I can say I bet with Isis that they'd last. She thought it would just be a passing fling. And who won? Me. Obviously." There was obvious satisfaction in his voice. I recognize real love when I see it, especially after finding my own. The casual comment made me smile involuntarily, and I leaned against him briefly before returning to circulate among the guests, feeling the warmth of his hand on my back for a second, before we separated again to fulfill our roles as hosts. The hours passed in a pleasant mixture of conversations and laughter, and when the last guest finally left, it was past midnight. Isis and Marcel had been the last to go, with Isis hugging me tightly and whispering in my ear that she'd never seen her brother so happy, that I'd worked a miracle in making Salvatore Farnese relax the rigid control he maintained over everything in his life. I closed the door behind them and turned to find the apartment in a post-party state, empty glasses and scattered plates that the cleaning service would deal with in the morning. I started gathering some things mechanically, more out of habit than real necessity, and that's when I noticed Salvatore standing completely still near the living room wall, looking at something with an intensity that made my curiosity awaken. I followed his gaze and felt laughter bubbling in my throat when I saw what had captured his attention so completely. The golden lamp, that same one I'd held as a weapon on the first morning on the yacht, was hanging on the wall inside an elegant frame of glass and dark wood. Salvatore had insisted on framing it months ago, saying it was modern art, and I'd agreed because I secretly found the idea absurdly romantic. "You really framed the lamp I was going to use to attack you," I commented, walking over to stand beside him and looking at the golden object that gleamed softly under the careful lighting of the frame. "Marcel had the original idea," Salvatore admitted, not taking his eyes off the lamp. "But I enthusiastically approved and fully financed the execution." "You approved the idea of turning my self-defense attempt into decor," I corrected, feeling the smile growing on my lips. "This is simultaneously romantic and completely ridiculous. It's a reminder," he responded, finally turning to look at me with that intensity that still made my heart race even after a year, "of the exact moment I realized you were different from absolutely everything and everyone I'd known in my entire life." I felt something tighten in my chest at the words, the rare vulnerability he showed only with me in private moments. No one one had ever faced me that way," he continued, his voice low and loaded with memory. "With the expensive decorative lamp in your hands, an absolute determination to defend yourself even clearly not being in condition to fight. It was in that moment, right there, that you fell in love?" I asked softly, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it anyway. "That I understood I was completely lost," he corrected, with that small smile that was only mine. Actually falling in love took about 3 more weeks, and an absurd amount of denial on my part. The laugh escaped before I could control it, genuine and loud enough to echo in the empty apartment. Salvatore pulled me closer, arms wrapping around my waist while I was still laughing, and then kissed me in a way that transformed the laughter into a sigh. The kiss was long and deep, loaded with an entire year of growing love and built trust and choices made together. When we finally separated, we stood there under the soft light illuminating the framed lamp, New York shining through the windows at our backs. "What if I'd missed the lamp and actually hit you?" I asked, playing with the collar of his shirt. "That first morning, if my aim had been better, I would have let you hit me," Salvatore responded without hesitation. "You clearly needed that moment of control over the situation, and a lamp to the head would be a small price to pay to see that fire in your eyes." I looked at him incredulous and amused at the same time. "Is that love or masochism? With you?" He pulled me even closer, eliminating any space that still existed between our bodies. "Sometimes it's exactly the same thing, and I wouldn't change anything." He paused, that dangerous smile touching his lips. "Now shut up, Hampton." The kiss that followed was different from the previous one, more intense and urgent, his hands finding my hair while mine closed on his shirt. And when we finally separated out of necessity for air, we were both breathing heavily. 6 months later, the Farnese yacht cut through the calm waters of the Mediterranean under a sky beginning to lighten with sunrise, and I was on deck with hot coffee in my hands, watching the horizon change colors as the day began. I'd flown to meet Salvatore after a particularly exhausting week of meetings in New York, and now I was enjoying the peace that came only from being on the open sea away from everything. I heard familiar footsteps approaching and felt a smile touching my lips before even turning. Salvatore sat in the chair beside me in silence, holding his own cup of coffee, and we stayed like that for full minutes, just existing in the same space while the sun rose slowly. "Remember when you said I was staying here under protection?" I finally asked, turning to look at him. "I remember," he responded, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "It sounded a lot like possession at that moment," I commented, taking a sip of coffee. "It sounded that way because it was," he admitted without beating around the bush, turning now to face me with that brutal honesty that had become the hallmark of our entire relationship. "In the beginning it was exactly that, possessive instinct disguised as necessary protection. And now, I already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it from him anyway." Salvatore took my free hand, intertwining his fingers with mine in a way that had become second nature. "Now, it's still possession. I won't lie about that, but it's reciprocal, balanced. You possess me as much as I possess you." "Yes," I agreed, squeezing his hand. "That's exactly it." The silence returned, but it was comfortable and complete, full of everything that had happened since that first morning when I woke up in an unfamiliar suite. The sea stretched in all directions. The sun continued rising, painting the sky impossible colors, and the coffee was perfect. And there we were, two impossibles who found each other because of a calculated push, a golden lamp used as a weapon, and the absolute stubbornness of neither one giving in first. Now we were just the two of us in the middle of the Mediterranean, choosing to wake up together and watch the sunrise, choosing complicated love and reciprocal possessiveness, and the future we were building side by side. Final message. I confess that Valerie almost killed me with that lamp. Not literally, of course. But writing a protagonist who wakes up in panic and decides expensive decor is a viable weapon. Genius and exhausting at the same time. I spent 3 days rewriting that scene because I needed you to feel her adrenaline, the desperation disguised as courage, without falling into the cliché of the helpless damsel. Salvatore was my biggest challenge. How many times did I write Mafia Don and delete it angrily because it sounded like every dark romance that exists? He needed to be dangerous without being abusive, possessive without being toxic, controlling out of genuine protection and not fragile ego. The line is as thin as a razor's edge. The framed lamp at the end? A 3 a.m. idea that made me laugh alone like crazy. Because that's exactly what love does. Transforms absurd moments into sacred relics. Margaret hurt to write. Family betrayal always hurts, even being fiction. But you know what I loved most? The precisely measured 50 centimeters. His obsession with details about her. The 3 languages. the jealousy disguised as managerial efficiency. Love is in the details no one else would notice. P.S. If you don't frame something ridiculous from your relationship after reading this, you miss the entire message. And if you want to check out another deep story of true love, click on the video that appears now on your screen.